A warm welcome to our speakers, Maryam and Sara. Sara is a senior lecturer, associate professor in management at Birkbeck University University of London in the UK, and Maryam is a senior lecturer in human resource management at Aston Business School. So Sara's research interests are in diversity and employment experiences and changing the environment relationship. Maryam's research interests cover, amongst other topics, equality, workforce diversity, and women's employment. So I met both these speakers last September 2021, when we were still deep in the COVID pandemic, I guess. And they gave a talk about burnout in academia similar to today. And that was one of those talks that just lingered with me. Days later, I would think about the insights, the perspectives, and the unique angles that were presented, lived, and discussed. And the most powerful aspect for me, I think, was the fact that I just felt heard. I felt seen. And most importantly, I just did not feel alone anymore in the feelings I have and the emotions. And I just felt as if I was a person that was going through similar emotions and fears and hopes as all the other researchers also. So I am truly unbelievably happy to have both speakers here today and share their insights. And I hope that they will ring some truth within you as well if you if you chose to join today's session. So please welcome me, join me in welcoming Maryam and Sara.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, that was a masterclass in introductions. I do very good ones, but I have to say, as you were speaking, I was really like, I almost forgot that you were introducing me for a bit. It was absolutely brilliant. And I think like I really loved about your introduction was that you actually also highlighted how you were feeling today. And I thought it would be amazing if we could start academic meetings by actually very truthfully highlighting how we're feeling, because Maryam and I were just talking about this, that it's ironic we're doing a talk on burnout and I'm quite unwell and have had to work through that illness to a very large extent, and Mariam's had like a very busy routine as well, and we thought, you know what, like let's get in there and enjoy ourselves. And it went, as soon as you said highlighted how you're feeling, I thought, that would be a way of doing. So, I mean, as the introduction has highlighted, we don't need to go through the institution that we come from, but I think it is worth grounding how personal this research is, and so how actually touched we were to be invited, and how excited we become when we're invited to talk about burnout in academia specifically, because our actual genuine research streams that we have actually produced a lot of output on are slightly different. They're around the issues of employment relationships and diversity issues, specifically gender issues. But burnout is something that both Maryam and I experienced, and it had very different manifestations. So I think Maryam won't mind me saying that for Maryam it led to a lot of mental health issues. For me, it led to very significant physical issues. I have a very severe sleeping disorder now. I, at one point in time, was 3 times the size that I am right now. So there was, both of us actually genuinely experienced physical and mental, kind of outcomes as a result of burnout that we experienced during our especially initial years in academia. And then what was very interesting was that alongside this very personal experience of academia and burnout in academia, the pandemic happened. And what that did was that it brought us a lot of peace and calm, and allowed us to actually start creating very strong coping mechanisms of how to deal with burnout. But everybody around us, their burnout escalated naturally, because people had different family and care responsibilities, they had very different living arrangements, and so we suddenly had this shift in lens where we were now looking outside at other people and realizing that, first of all, this is very much a shared phenomenon, and it had become really like there was a spotlight on it because of the pandemic. And then we also realized that this is a conversation that is not happening even though everybody is experiencing it. So this is why I say we especially especially love being asked to come and talk about burnout, because then this is research very much primed by our own experiences and the experiences of very well loved friends and colleagues who went through a lot of and shared a lot of personal experiences. And so just to reiterate what Ghazal said at the start as well, obviously this part is being recorded, but the discussion section will not be recorded, so that we can actually have hopefully a very shared, like the whole point of this and why Maryam and I do this research now is specifically to touch base and share experiences with other people who are going through very similar circumstances and career stages and life experiences. And so this is very much as much of a learning experience and a conversation for us as it is for you guys as well. Mariam, do you want to jump in at this point and say anything, or should I just kick off with the actual talk itself? Yeah? Okay, thank you so much. So why are we talking about burnout? Because, specifically what has happened in the last few years that has really drawn a lot of attention to this. And there are some interesting things that have happened. So there is a reason why this conversation on burnout in our own personal lives as well as the media has gone up. And first of all, this was very much driven by the fact that the WHO in 2019 recognized that burnout is actually a syndrome. So previously, this used to be referred to as a phenomenon, just like a workplace phenomenon. And the WHO realized that actually it is something a little bit more serious than that. So they actually changed their definition, the wording of the definition, and they said, we can now define this as a syndrome, and it has three key components. So first of all, emotional exhaustion and energy depletion. Secondly, depersonalization, so feeling like a distance from your work. And this would also include feelings of negativity or cynicism towards your job. And then finally, diminished professional efficacy. And so this would very much be along the lines of questioning your professionalism, questioning your professional ability, basically. And then this then in turn has implications for your connection with your organization, your relationship with your colleagues and your co-workers as well. Now, you would be wondering, why is this such an important thing that in 2019 this was classified as a syndrome? Because if you look at some of the historical analysis of WHO changing their minds on certain things, you will realize that actually perhaps in the next decade or so, this could go on to be classified as a medical condition. And the reason for that is that in previous years, osteoporosis, for example, was just very much seen as a phenomenon of aging, but then it was classified as a syndrome and eventually as a medical condition. So the fact that the WHO has recently said that actually we need to take burnout more seriously and they've reclassified it as a syndrome means that I think the conversation is very much going down the line of this could eventually be highlighted as a genuine medical condition. And that is really something that Maryam and I will highlight on, because that is very much what our research has started showing as well. So in many ways, this conversation about burnout is very timely and it is very important, because it is something that has been studied, but there needs to be a different lens to it. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Not to bore you too much, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but obviously, like, burnout, as I said, is not a new phenomenon. This has been studied quite extensively in organizational psychology, especially. And so there's a huge amount of research on how burnout, first of all, is different from exhaustion and stress. And then what are the outcomes of burnout in terms of loss of creativity, in terms of, reduced commitment towards your work, your occupational role, towards the organization, disengagement, absenteeism. So there's a lot of emphasis, especially on outcomes. And what you'll see from just looking at this particular slide is that there is a very large emphasis on the organizational level of analysis. So burnout is very much studied in the workplace. There is a real emphasis on what happens when you have burnout in the workplace in terms of employment outcomes, in terms of employee experiences, but it's all very much embedded at the organizational level of analysis. And so once again, what this does is that, first of all, it obviously creates a salience towards, your context. And especially given the audience here, we are going to talk about how academia as a professional context has an impact on burnout. But then what Maryam and I in our research are trying to really highlight is that we perhaps need to now extend our lens and think about burnout beyond the workplace, because as a phenomenon, as a medical condition, or as a syndrome, not as yet as a medical condition, it has a lot of overlapping repercussions on all the different roles that we play in life in general. But there is, of course, a huge amount of organizational level research on this. And so the idea is very much to see, is this current research actually capturing the full, experience of burnout that all of us actually go through. So, could you go to the next one? Now, this is in many ways the money making slide, because also, why are we talking about burnout in academia specifically? And if you do a quick kind of, social media or media analysis, you will realize that in the last 3 or 4 years in particular, there has been a lot of generation of, media pieces in particular around burnout in academia. And I think the audience here will very much sympathize with me when I say that burnout specifically in academia is understandable, because we are a very unique profession that is supposed to juggle several caps at the same time and juggle them in the best possible way. So there is a huge amount of emphasis on excellence and perfectionism in academia, but it's not for one thing. You have to teach really well and get very good teaching scores at the end of your courses or your modules. You have to do excellent research and basically publish a certain amount of journal articles or books in the best possible outlets. You need to have PhD students and be a very caring, intellectually stimulating, and emotionally supportive supervisor. You need to have leadership roles. And this is kind of like a babushka doll environment, where if you have a leadership role at the team level, you should now be aspiring for a leadership role at the department level. If you have something at the department level, you should be aspiring for the school level. So the reality is that, we're constantly being asked to aim for a higher level, whether that's in terms of number of outputs, amount of research, number of grant applications, number of PhD students, the size, the enormity and seriousness of the leadership role. So it is very much, a very unique context in which actually you are being asked to simultaneously juggle several roles and several tasks, but in the best possible way. And at the same time, if you, go to the next slide, Maryam, this is accompanied by a lot of contextual factors and a lot of contextual, pressures in academia. So first of all, COVID has had a very large impact. There is now preliminary research coming out which has highlighted that the number of, quantitatively speaking, the number of working hours has increased for academics pretty much on a global scale. So workload has gone up. Then you obviously also have had, the economic fallout of COVID and the fact that there are recessionary conditions of some sort and stagflation in many countries, which means that there are now layoffs or hiring freezes, which is increasing pressure on all of us that are currently have a job in academia. And then you also have certain very cultural aspects to academia. There is a real acceptance of workaholism. This sets in when we're doing our PhDs. We're supposed to work very long hours. We're supposed to work over the weekends. We're supposed to send emails and respond to our supervisors as the minute they send us an email, whatever time of the day or week it is. And there is a real virtue signaling attached to it. So there is virtue in working, long hours. You mostly ask any academic across several different countries. I've actually experimented this, that, you ask them a pretty easygoing question like, how do you spend your free time? And the chances are that your academic friend or colleague is going to just pull a face and be like, free time? I mean, is there free time in academia? Not really. I don't really remember the last time I actually had like proper free time. And then you start thinking about this answer and you realize that that is true. Even when you were on a holiday recently, you were very aware of everything that you had not finished. So you were very aware of, the papers that you hadn't reviewed, the references that you hadn't written, the student emails that perhaps were far too long and emotional and you left them unanswered. Some form of marking that has not happened on time, basically. And so there is a real kind of, virtue signaling as with respect to the number of hours that we work, and then presenteeism as well, being seen to work those hours, sending emails at all times of the day and over the weekend as well. And so we have like quite a lot of research then, which highlights this leads to pretty significant mental health and physical health issues. So there is a rather large amount of data that has been done by relatively large projects, such as the Wellcome Trust, which has highlighted that researchers, they experience mental health issues because of unkind and aggressive conditions in the workplace. They either want to or have sought help for a range of what are now known as the diseases of despair. So this is anxiety, this is, basically depression, and then physical health issues as well. Alcoholism, apparently research has shown, is very much on the rise in academia. Sleeping disorders is something that is very common. Once again, if I was to just ask, like, I'm not going to, but I suspect there are going to be quite a few people here who actually suffer from sleep problems. And certainly, I have not managed to fix that issue, basically. So you clearly can see that academia in particular is this really unique pressure cooker, which has a very unique set of cultural and structural, characteristics that then enhance this current conversation that we have around burnout and burnout during post the pandemic, basically. So Maryam, could you go to the next one? So what we're very quickly going to do is just highlight to you, as soon as we realized this, we thought, okay, we know the literature on burnout, but something very different is happening right now. First of all, the current definitions of burnout make it a real point to highlight that this is not a medical condition. And yet there is a lot of survey data that is coming out that is showing that it's manifested in physical and mental health issues, basically. So this was the first starting point as to, okay, do we need to really start rethinking how we actually approach burnout? And perhaps there is a medical element to it. The second thing that we very quickly realized was that there is a huge amount of emphasis in current burnout literature on the organizational level of analysis, as I highlighted previously. And what we very quickly realized was, and this is really where a lot of our research has been focusing on, is that, to what extent does burnout bleed out into the non-occupational world, basically, so this is life context, perhaps, and especially given, in the aftermath of the pandemic, where a lot of us have had to work from home, and perhaps many of those working from home arrangements are going to continue. The boundary between work and family / life is very, amorphous now. And so perhaps this like overemphasis on burnout is something that is specific to the workplace, needs to be, reassessed. And then the final thing that we highlighted is very much driven by the fact that we are women and we are academics, but then we're also talking to people who are experiencing burnout, is that we all tend to have certain demographic characteristics that lead to very different patterns of burnout. And so this is also a conversation that we wanted to have with you guys today, to really see if some of the preliminary research that we're doing in this area actually plays out when we talk about people's real life experiences as well. So what I'm going to now do is very quickly hand over to Maryam, because there are two key pieces of research that we've done on this, and then we're working on developing more projects on this. So very quickly, she's going to talk to you about burnout and the experience of a female academic, and then I'll come and very quickly talk about this other piece. But really what we're more excited about is, given the fact that the whole, this research objective is very much driven by people's experiences, is to actually then have a conversation with you guys. So over to you, Maryam. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction as well. Thank you everyone for having me here. As Sarah mentioned, it's a topic we're quite both very passionate about. Maybe Sarah more than me a little bit, but it's a topic that we are interested in. And I bring here my gender interest in terms of gender, understanding gender as well. And we start to look at pandemic, and we realize, as Sarah said, that different women having different experience than us. Maybe our coping mechanism was quite different than other people. So we conducted a research that focused specifically at academic who during the pandemic, and we did it early on, and we did adopt this narrative method, which we interview one academic in detail and ask about the boundaries between the two spaces, home and also work. Just to give you background, gender burnout, extending burnout research have focused in a lot of majority of research focus in helping services, and that's quite expected because it's usually under resources, but also there is a lot of stress in those kind of jobs like nursing, medical doctors, and teacher, and it's involved a lot of emotional investment in those jobs. However, what's quite interesting when we start reviewing the research, they still didn't make a lot of gender differences. They present burnout as general in the sector without taking understanding of general differences. Again, we start to review the literature. We wanted to see why burnout exists in some sectors, and what we found out that it also exists in sectors that have a lot of emphasis in high performance, a lot of managerial controls within the organization, such as academia, obviously, but also law firm and so on. Again, the research didn't take to consideration gender differences, and that's quite surprising, especially that there is a lot of research, sociology research, that say females still facing a lot of inequality in the workplace. Females still women still doesn't get promoted, doesn't have equal opportunity as male in the organization, especially with academia context and other contexts as well. And all of those factors where woman is doing more work and a lot of pressure, and woman is pushed sometimes to precarity contracts where it's fixed, not fixed, it's a fixed contract and so on, is a manifestation of burnout. So we found that how burnout is presented as the gender neutral is quite interesting and starting point for us to understand why they didn't capture the gender differences. And even if the few research that look at gender differences, they usually focus on the structural mechanism. We wanted to understand the individual differences, why burnout can be experienced differences between male and men, between male and women, but also what kind of coping mechanism. And that was our starting point in this research. And then we have the pandemic happening and a lot of changes in the work atmosphere, a lot of changes introduced very quickly. And I start to look at several, I mean, I start to look at surveys that conducted by UCL, which is the Union of UK. And they show that when they conducted the survey among 12,000 lecture and professional services, they found that 45 of the staff are struggling with the increase of workload, and we're still struggling and suffering poor mental health because of the pandemic and COVID. And more than less than 57% indicate that the work have been a lot and it's still increasing. Staff were not happy with the level of support from the management. Some people even were pushed to work through the pandemic in a place that they didn't feel it's safe. And also what's quite interesting that a lot of ethnic minority and were facing that they feel that they are doing more in terms of emotional support to the student and so on. So that make us think about what is the differences. We try to understand in this research the overall aim to understand what genders account of burnout, especially how women may experience burnout at a multiple levels, and the efficiency of their subsequent coping strategy. Because what's quite important in 2020, I think the pandemic started in 2020 in March. What happened that school closed, women were children didn't go to school, and the expectation that homeschooling and doing the job introduced a lot of changes in the workplace, and we expected that a lot of emphasis and a lot of pressure putting in families as well. When we conducted the research, we focused specifically in females because what was evident in some of the general finding in the conducted research, and also what was written in one of the newspaper, that pandemic forced women to go back to the 80s where they were doing the double shifts. The boundaries, but as Sarah mentioned, between the two spaces become very difficult to manage. So women were not only forced to do, and this is not me saying it, the result of research say that women still doing a lot of the work at the house, doing the second shift, the unpaid work, while they are trying to manage to do their full jobs. So we interviewed a colleague who is working in a university and have two children, and during the beginning of the pandemic, to understand how she is coping, but what kind of manifestation that she is using to cope with the burnout. And what was quite clear that when the pandemic started, lack of resources, double, triple, or double teaching, a lot of work is increased, and she highlighted that it will be a very difficult year for me in terms of work. For example, she was saying there is a massive pressure and uncertainty. They change the rules all the time. Uncertainty about the workload. We have been told the workload is going to be more full on, and also there wasn't a lot of supportive management. All of us, we are in it, but we're trying to learn how to do lectures online. We're trying to manage also how to manage our personal life and so on. So it was a massive burnout for a lot of people, but especially people who have children and trying to accommodate the life, their shift at work, but also their shift at home. So what was quite interesting, we wanted to understand the boundaries between the two spaces, and if shifting from working from home also created a massive increase in burnout. And what was evident in this, our participant was saying, since the pandemic, my husband tend to hoover more often than he used to be. In the past, he only hoovered the living room. Nowadays, he realized that he need to hoover more rooms and more often because we are indoor all the time. So there was a lot of pressure. With my partner, there is no discussion, the distribution as it is, but there is a lot of resentment. And all of this kind of feeling created a lot of burnout, not only emotional burnout, not only in terms of work, but also when you know in the end of your very long day working, you have the second shift, taking care of the children, doing the teaching, and obviously doing the work in the house as well. And when then we try to understand how did they cope with this massive multiplier burnout, not only at work but also at home. And what was quite interesting from the gender perspective, that the coping mechanism, most of research say that women usually do emotional coping mechanism. And what we find here actually, in terms of work, there was a lot of denial and disengagement to reserve the energy, to reserve their energy. So this participant was specifically saying, I feel I'm in denial period. The university want us to teach in person and still denial period. I have asthma and I have to be public transport. I can't imagine this will happen. During the speaking, and trying to reserve the energy of resisting. I don't believe in resisting. I want to reserve my energy, and that's what's quite important. That the coping mechanism that this participant adopted is reserve the energy. When it comes to home burnout, what quite interesting as well, our participant was also trying to reserve her energy by not getting in argument. So honestly, I feel on daily basis that I need to keep my energy because my energy has to go to work, to cooking, so many extra things and need to be done. So there was a massive avoiding of experience burnout. Instead of dealing with it, there was a massive avoiding. It was like there is no time to deal with burnout. I need to reserve it. I have to do burnout at work, but I have burnout at home, and I need to reserve my energy just to keep going. What we found in this research that women, when they experience burnout, their coping mechanism from work and home was usually by adopting avoiding coping mechanism, but maintaining also energy. And that's quite problematic because not only it's have a massive effect in creativity, performance, and mental health as well, but it also normalize the gender inequality that within the society, but also within the workplace. And I understand that some people will try to come up by just saving the energy, and rightly so. but that normalize, and this is a quite important point that we try to make in our paper, that normalize the gender equality that might exist and manifest at work and at home. I will let Sarah talk a little bit about our second paper.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Maryam. So, as that particular piece of research highlighted, that was very much obviously a gender focus, and what it highlighted was what we had already suspected, that this kind of boundary between work and life is actually not as clear as current burnout literature and current conceptualization of burnout has highlighted. So, we wanted to push this boundary a little bit more and really see to what extent does a larger context have an impact. So, this particular piece was looking at then the impact of the pandemic, and specifically a specific time point in the pandemic, which was the first lockdown, basically, to see if time and larger socio-political contexts have an impact on burnout. So, Mariam, if you go forward. So, obviously, as expected, there were, I mean, go to the next slide. So as expected, we did see that, of course, there were, implications for the organizational context. So obviously, given the research was in the UK, this very much looked at the National Health Service and the fact that they were quite underprepared as far as, when the first wave of the pandemic struck. There was relatively low understanding of the virus globally, obviously, but this then led to very different practices across different NHS clinics. There were shortages of actual kind of equipment, PPE, inadequate intensive care facilities as well. So the organizational context and how the NHS was primed to respond to the pandemic and how they actually responded was actually quite significant. So Mariam, if you go to the next slide. So what that highlighted was that in our own research, the organizational context was obviously quite salient. So our participants, and this was specifically focusing on NHS doctors, so there was like a real sense that, of course, the impact of the organizational aspect on burnout was quite high. So this is a quotation from one of the doctors that we spoke to, and she basically said that, I experienced very high levels of a burnout, specifically energy depletion, because they did not have enough PPE staff, and people were, a lot of people were going off unwell, and that really led to a spiral in her mental health, because she had already been sick with COVID and was worried about getting it again because she'd had very extreme reactions to it. So you can very much see that there was very chronic energy depletion because of the organizational circumstances. So this, of course, highlights what we already know in research, that organization context is quite important. In this situation, it was obviously the NHS and the lack of facilities and the lack of preparation for the pandemic. Mariam, next slide. But what was very unique about this particular research was that we really started identifying factors outside of the workplace that have an impact. And of course, the first one was that, what the research really highlighted was that, the public's attitude actually had a very direct impact on the, employees' experience of burnout. And employees in this instance was obviously NHS doctors. So you could very much, we did this interesting piece of research where we showed, the NHS doctors' pictures, similar to the one that we have on the screen right now, where there are people gathered on a beach, while obviously, despite there being a lockdown, and despite the fact that these NHS doctors were working extremely long hours, and they were, very, very under a huge amount of work pressure. And so what we really identified was that, patterns of depersonalization and emotional exhaustion were very much tied to how the public was behaving, because there was the sense that we are really suffering in the workplace. We have these traumatic shifts, people are dying, we don't know what's happening, we are constantly exposing ourselves to ill health and potential death, because keep in mind this was the first wave, so things were quite serious at that point in time. And the public obviously is not displaying serious enough attitude. So there was a direct link between public attitudes and burnout in the workplace. Mariam, the next slide. And then, of course, in a larger context, there was also this sense of burnout being tied to public policy. So there was a huge amount of, conversation around the government's role, the fact that the government had not been prepared in a budgetary sense. They had not basically taken the action in a timely fashion, basically. So once again, the analysis of these conversations highlighted that there was a lot of the fatigue that people were experiencing in the workplace was very much being traced back to a much larger macro level issue, which was governmental policy, because obviously that has a very direct impact on the NHS. And then finally, this also highlighted a very specific pattern of burnout. So, what the research has currently shown is that employees often tend to experience emotional exhaustion, which then leads to depersonalization or stepping away from work, which then in turn leads to a reduction in professional efficacy. But what we really highlighted was that because of this, the nature of the job, they were doctors, they had gone into the profession in order to save people and save lives. There was no reduction in professional efficacy. And so there was a very different pattern of burnout where there was a maintenance of professional efficacy with higher levels of depersonalization and emotional exhaustion, which is something that has not really been highlighted in the current, research, the existing research. And why this was interesting, because this to some extent actually applies to us. People going into academia tend to score quite highly on certain personality traits like empathy, sensitivity, like, basically being interested in and involved in social justice, some elements of serving essentially. And what we were hypothesizing was that many professions that are going to have these implications of service and social justice and care and empathy are probably not going to go down on professional efficacy, but it is going to have a direct impact on some of the other, components of burnout. So, Mariam, could we just go to the next slide? So we can go to the next slide. I think let's look at the contributions. So overall, then, the current research that we've done and what we're hoping to do is that, first of all, we really tried to highlight through our research that burnout is much more than just an occupational syndrome. It is not something that can be actually restricted to the workplace. And so we really need to rethink current definitions and organizational responses to burnout, because it's very much seen as something that happens at work and then it's going to stay there, which is actually not the case. And our research has highlighted that there tends to be a bit of a link between what you're experiencing at work versus what you're experiencing at home, and this link has been exacerbated because of the pandemic and working from home conditions. And then, of course, extending our analysis and thinking about factors beyond the organization, we've highlighted that you're going to have external circumstances, specific points in time that are directly also going to impact burnout. So, for example, recessionary conditions, any kind of natural disasters, all of these are problems that are very much a part of our lives, unfortunately now. Governmental policy, all of these create certain socio-political narratives that directly impact then the experience of burnout at home and in the workplaces as well. And then finally, identifying unique patterns of burnout. So what we're really saying is, yes, these three components of burnout are super important, but who feels what can actually be quite different depending on whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a carer or not, whether you're working in a specific profession or not. And even just before this, talk, Mariam and I were talking about it, and actually we were like, we experience burnout in very different ways, even though we work together quite closely, but the manifestation is quite different. So, Mariam, what we're hoping to do now is, as I said, like the real kind of selfish desire is to have a conversation around it, because I feel like it makes us feel like we are, doing something that is really productive and actually having an impact on other people's lives. But it also, this is a room full of academics, and it is really wonderful to feel that you are not alone, and to really hear other people's voices as well. So the idea here is that perhaps we could break out. I know that there's a huge amount of breakout room fatigue where people are like, oh my God, not again. But, the power of basically meeting up like this as opposed to being in a room means that, this is possible. So a silver lining. And what I'm thinking is maybe we can have two breakout rooms, and Both breakout rooms can have a discussion around these points where, and this is very much driven by, first of all, our own personal experiences, but then also selfishly what our research is hoping to look at as well. So first of all, to have a conversation amongst ourselves in smaller groups on what specific component of burnout actually is most salient for you. And as I mentioned, Maureen and I were just talking about it, and we had very different perspectives on this. But more importantly, then to really like highlight or to maybe have a conversation around how burnout in the workplace bleeds into your home life or your life in general, and then vice versa. And then finally, perhaps like some kind of coping strategies. We've had this conversation several times in these kind of small platforms, and we always learn something new.